What would you do if you were removed from a first-class seat simply because you didn't look like someone who usually sits there? The first-class ticket on that morning's Altavia Airways flight was more than just a boarding pass. It was a quiet litmus test for a system that appeared polished and perfect. Elijah Morgan boarded the first-class cabin with a calm and understated demeanor. He wore a charcoal linen shirt, polished black loafers, a slim leather document case in one hand, and a compact cabin suitcase in the other. No assistant, no security, no fanfare. He selected seat 2A, a spot he had reserved nearly 2 weeks earlier. This flight would take him to Berlin for the World Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Ethics, where he was the keynote speaker, representing Aegis Tech, the $2.8 billion tech firm he had founded. But few knew that what Elijah truly carried wasn't just a speech. It was a quiet belief that the world could change if someone dared to stand for justice at the right moment. Seat 2A, by the window, spacious, with generous legroom, was his usual choice on business trips. He sat down, adjusted the recline angle slightly, and opened his tablet to review his presentation slides. But within 2 minutes, someone stopped beside his seat. "Excuse me, sir, but there seems to be a mix-up," came a soft but pointed voice. Elijah looked up. The chief flight attendant, Chloe Rivers, stood there with a polite smile and eyes that flickered with discomfort. "This seat is currently prioritized for one of our long-standing VIP customers, Mrs. Veronica Lane. She's one of our elite platinum members," Elijah responded calmly, neither rushed nor sharp. "I'm also a platinum member, and this is the seat I selected and was assigned. Here are my card and boarding pass." He held out both, his expression composed. Chloe took them, checked briefly, and hesitated before continuing. "Yes, I see everything is valid. But this seat is traditionally reserved for customers with long-standing ties to the airline, and Mrs. Lane, she's been seated here for years." The words, though cloaked in courtesy, made one thing crystal clear. The presence of a black man, regardless of his status, was still seen as out of place in that seat. At that moment, Mrs. Veronica Lane approached from the back of the cabin, platinum hair in a sleek bun, beige cashmere coat, and a Hermes bag radiating the air of practiced authority. She stopped in the aisle, didn't bother to look at Elijah, and turned to Chloe, speaking loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I always sit there. Everyone knows that. Why is someone else in my seat today?" To emphasize her point, she glanced at Elijah with detached indifference and turned away. Elijah said nothing. He simply looked up, eyes steady, his breath slowing not from confusion but because he understood. He had just entered a moment with no return. Passengers began to glance over, some discreetly raising phones to record. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened, silent and tense like the pause before an explosion. But what caught Elijah's attention was not the words, but the actions. In the moment, Chloe bent forward, pretending to adjust her pocket. Mrs. Lane discreetly slipped a folded bill into her coat. A subtle move, but not fast enough to escape Elijah's eyes, or those of another passenger sitting diagonally across, phone camera already recording. That moment, quiet, non-violent, was the beginning of a storm. Elijah Morgan didn't react. He simply nodded once and returned to his tablet, as if nothing had happened. But inside, he was cataloging every detail because he knew that silence, timed right, could echo louder than any argument. And today, he would let the system answer to the public with its own unfiltered truth. Elijah Morgan had never been the type to react impulsively. He had sat through hundreds of meetings with the toughest investors in Silicon Valley, faced off with top CEOs of multinational corporations, and had often walked past skeptical glances cast his way for no reason other than the color of his skin. But what made this moment different was that he was being humiliated, openly, blatantly, on a flight operated by the very airline his company was in strategic talks with. Chloe did not stop at merely suggesting a seat change. She stepped forward, leaned in slightly, and lowered her voice to a sweet but pressuring tone. "We really hope you can cooperate. There are plenty of other seats available in first class. If you agree to move to seat 4D, we'll offer you a lounge voucher and a special glass of champagne." Elijah kept his eyes on the tablet screen, but his hand now rested on his phone. He did not respond right away. That brief pause made Chloe slightly uneasy. A few passengers were now paying closer attention, and the tension in the cabin seemed to thicken. Elijah finally looked up, his voice deep and steady, each word deliberate. "I don't need a drink. I don't need a voucher. I just need the seat I reserved, with the full rights that come with it." At that moment, a middle-aged man in a suit, Trevor Dane, the cabin manager, approached. He looked at Chloe, then glanced at Elijah like someone already familiar with these kinds of issues. Without asking questions, Trevor stepped closer, standing tall, and spoke in a loud, deliberate voice so nearby passengers could hear clearly. "Sir, if you do not comply, we will be forced to proceed according to protocol. That seat is routinely prioritized for our honored guests." Elijah turned to Trevor, his gaze piercing through the subtle twitch of the man's tense jaw. "You said protocol? What policy allows you to force a passenger with a valid ticket to give up his seat simply because someone else is used to sitting there?" Trevor hesitated for a moment, but quickly tried to regain his formal tone. "We're allowed to reassign seats at our discretion for the convenience and satisfaction of our elite clientele." "And I'm not an elite client?" Elijah asked back, never raising his voice. A heavy silence settled over the first-class cabin, but not everyone remained silent. A young woman nearby subtly lifted her phone to record the entire exchange. Behind them, a man whispered, "Why are they pressuring him like this? He hasn't done anything wrong." Meanwhile, Veronica Lane still stood calmly in the aisle, inspecting her manicure as if awaiting an outcome she'd already expected. Then, to seal the moment of humiliation, Trevor leaned in closer, voice lowered just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We can make this easy, or complicated. The choice is yours." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his gaze now cold as steel. "I choose to keep my seat, because I do not surrender what I am rightfully entitled to." 6 words, clear, sharp, unwavering. Trevor flushed red, spun around, and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin where the intercom phone was located. The move did not go unnoticed by the passengers watching closely. The cabin grew so still that the soft click of Veronica's fingernail and the measured steps of Chloe walking away could be clearly heard. She glanced back at Elijah, a look of resignation in her eyes, as if realizing she had just lost a game she thought she had already won. But she was wrong, because the man in seat 2A was not just any passenger. He held the fate of this airline in his hands. And behind the cockpit door, a single misjudgment was being made, one whose consequences would reach far beyond this cabin, stirring a quiet storm no one had anticipated. Elijah Morgan, dismissed for his appearance, was about to make an entire organization pay for forgetting that sometimes silence is the most powerful form of protest. And this time, he didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed the right moment. As two uniformed security officers stepped into the first-class cabin, the entire space seemed to hold its breath. No alarms, no shouting, just the heavy rhythm of approaching footsteps and the synchronized shifting of passengers' gazes. Elijah Morgan remained seated in 2A, back straight, chin lifted, as if watching a play he had long since memorized. One of the officers, shorter with a thick mustache, spoke first in a flat tone that sounded rehearsed. "We've been asked to escort you off this flight for obstructing crew operations." Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable. "I just want to confirm. You're asking me to vacate a legitimately reserved seat after I've provided all required documentation and violated no policy whatsoever." The question was not meant to argue, but to force everyone in the cabin to confront the truth. The taller officer glanced nervously at Captain Harland, standing silently at the end of the aisle, eyes avoiding contact like a student caught cheating. Eventually, the officer lowered his voice. "We're just following orders from above." Elijah stood up, unhurried, composed, not a single movement of resistance. He buttoned his coat, picked up his slim document case and the phone he had discreetly placed on record mode in the seat pocket. A quiet wave of disapproval rippled through the cabin. A middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "It's awful. They're escorting him like he did something wrong." But everyone stayed seated, because polite society had long since mistaken silence for civility. As Elijah walked past row 3, Veronica Lane tilted her head slightly, eyes gleaming with triumph, as though natural order had just been restored. But Elijah didn't look at her. He stopped right in front of Trevor Dane, who had been observing everything from the cockpit door, his face caught between tension and smug satisfaction. Elijah said nothing, just looked him in the eye, not with anger or contempt, but as if logging a mental note. Then, as if something shifted behind his gaze, Elijah gave a slight nod, not a bow, but the kind of nod that closes a case file with finality. The cabin door closed behind him, and just seconds after setting foot on solid ground outside the terminal, Elijah tapped out a message to the COO of Aegis Tech. "Initiate Delta Protocol. Suspend all negotiations with Altavia. Emergency meeting in 30 minutes. Include legal and Patkur." A young woman in a white shirt, petite in frame, hurried after him in Concourse E5. "Excuse me, I recorded the whole thing from the moment Mrs. Lane slipped money to the flight attendant." She held up her phone, hands slightly trembling. "I'm a media studies student. I know this matters, and I'm willing to testify if needed." Elijah looked at her, and for the first time, a smile crossed his face. Not because he was pleased, but because he understood that truth, when backed by action, carries more weight than any business card. He nodded, took her contact information, and continued toward the VIP exit, where a black car waited quietly. Inside the car, Elijah opened his tablet and pulled up Aegis Tech's shareholder dashboard for Altavia Airways. The number glowed in the corner of the screen, 24.8%. Enough to call an emergency shareholders meeting. Enough to question executive competence. Enough to dismantle the entire leadership team, if necessary. And those still seated in that airplane cabin, they had no idea that the man they had just removed from seat 2A was the one who held the power to dismantle the entire system they were serving. And the storm had only just begun. On the 35th floor of Altavia Airways headquarters, Richard Fontaine, the chief executive officer, had just stepped out of a strategic shareholder meeting when he received a call from the Emergency Communications Division. The head of PR spoke with urgency. "Sir, we have a serious issue, A video is spreading online at lightning speed." Richard frowned. "What is it? Passenger delay? Cancelled flight?" The voice on the other end swallowed hard. "No. It's a black passenger being forcibly removed from a first-class seat, despite having a valid ticket. And there is footage showing a flight attendant accepting money from another passenger." Richard dropped into his chair, eyes glued to the screen as the link was forwarded. Within seconds, he realized the truth was even worse than he had imagined. The clip clearly showed Veronica slipping money into Chloe's jacket pocket, the smug whisper, the unsettling calm of the man being removed, and finally, the look he gave Trevor before walking out. A chill ran down Richard's spine. He turned and asked the legal advisor beside him, "Get me that man's name." In less than a minute, the answer came. The advisor's voice caught in his throat. "His name is Elijah Morgan, CEO of Aegis Tech, and also the largest individual shareholder in Altavia." Richard Fontaine shot up from his seat as if someone had punched him in the chest. "What?" A stream of realizations flashed through his mind like electric shocks. Elijah, the man they were negotiating a $50 million modernization deal with. Elijah, the architect behind the behavioral analytics platform the airline was relying on for its service overhaul. And now Elijah, the man with enough shares to call an emergency shareholders meeting and dismantle the executive board. Hundreds of miles away, in the emergency conference room at the hotel where Elijah had just landed, the full legal, peaceful, and investment teams of Aegis Tech had taken their seats. Elise Carter, the company's COO, displayed real-time social media data on the main screen. #Justice for Elijah, #Altavia discriminates, and two-way. A not for sale were all trending rapidly. International media had begun covering the story. Even celebrities were speaking up. A calm man, fully documented, ejected from his seat just because he didn't look the part. This is 2025. Elijah didn't look at the charts, nor did he read the comments. He silently typed a command into his tablet. A dashboard appeared. "Request to convene emergency shareholders meeting. Reason, breach of business ethics and governance." Elise tilted her head, speaking in a low tone. "Are you sure? If we activate this, Altavia could collapse before today's market closes." Elijah nodded, eyes fixed on the screen. "They chose to gamble with my dignity. Now I'll gamble with their truth." Back at Altavia's headquarters, the legal department froze as they received a notification from the stock exchange. Shares had dropped 12% in just 3 hours. By day's end, the loss could reach 30%. Media vans swarmed the building like a modern siege. In the crisis room, Richard Fontaine turned on the speakerphone to hear a voice calm and hard as stone on the other end. "This is Elijah Morgan, and I will not accept an apology. I'm here to reclaim transparency from a system you let rot from within." No one in the room dared to speak. Because they all knew, the man who had been pulled from his seat on that plane was not a victim. He was the only one capable of resetting the ethical foundation of the airline they were steering. And now, every move they made was already too late. Because the wave they triggered wasn't just crashing down on their reputation, it might drown every career in that room. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, on the ground floor of Altavia's Human Resources Wing, 3 names were called over the intercom. Chloe Rivers, lead flight attendant, Trevor Dane, cabin manager, and Harland Gray, captain. They were instructed to report to conference room E12 immediately. No reason was given, no one escorted them. Only the quiet stares of their colleagues followed them down the hallway, a mixture of curiosity and concern, as if witnessing someone walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been sealed. Room E12 had no windows, no company logos, just 3 chairs placed side by side across from a long table where the HR director, senior legal counsel, and 2 plain-clothed security personnel were already seated. As soon as the 3 took their seats, the room was swallowed by silence. The HR director opened her laptop, her eyes devoid of emotion. Let's get straight to the point. As of now, each of you, in your capacity as official employees of Altavia Airways, are terminated immediately for gross professional misconduct and causing irreparable damage to the company. Chloe's eyes widened, her lips trembling. Harland lowered his head, his back hunched. Only Trevor jumped to his feet, shouting, "This is an overreaction! We were just following protocol. He was uncooperative, a disruptive passenger." The legal counsel didn't respond. Instead, he calmly turned the laptop around and hit play. The video showed a close-up of Veronica Lane discreetly slipping money into Chloe's jacket pocket. Then came the footage of Trevor leaning in, uttering cold threats, and finally Harland, who should have remained neutral, standing by in silence as the rights of a passenger were trampled. The HR director's voice cut through the silence, low but sharp as a nail being driven in. Accepting money from a passenger to forcibly change the seat of someone with a valid boarding pass, is that what you call following protocol? Chloe began to cry. Harland mumbled, "I trusted the crew's judgment. I didn't see the beginning." Trevor said nothing. His face was pale as chalk. And then the HR director spoke again, slowly. "Your actions didn't just ruin a flight. You dragged this entire airline into a crisis, and worse, you turned an innocent man into a symbol of injustice that each of you helped enable." When they were escorted out of the headquarters, none of them protested. The shame didn't need to be spoken. It clung to each of their steps like a cold fog. They passed through the front lobby where their co-workers avoided eye contact. Out the door, no one wished them luck. No one said goodbye. They walked out like 3 shadows, drifting away from the very system they had helped corrupt from within. Meanwhile, in Altavia's largest auditorium, for the first time, the entire staff had gathered in one place. Richard Fontaine stood at the podium beside Elijah Morgan. White curtains were drawn back, and the large screen began to play the very video that had shaken the entire company. When the clip ended, there was no applause, no whispering, just the heavy silence of a workforce confronting the darkness they had never dared to name. Richard was the first to speak. "Today, we are not here to talk about reputation or market share. We are here to talk about character." He turned to Elijah, inviting him to step forward. Elijah didn't need a microphone. His voice was deep and clear enough to carry every word. "I didn't come here to make anyone bow their heads. I came to remind you that a system is only strong when it knows how to correct itself. If I hadn't been a CEO that day, but a teacher, a student, or a single mother, would they have been treated worse? And who would have stood up for them?" Then Elijah turned to Richard. "I'm requesting a comprehensive training, not just anti-discrimination, but real education on power, bias, and ethics. Every employee, from baggage handlers to the CEO, must participate. And the entire flight crew is to be grounded for 48 hours to begin that process." A murmur rose through the auditorium, but no one dared object, because deep down they knew, if they didn't change today, there might be no tomorrow. Not because of the market, but because of the rot growing within. 48 hours of silence. All Altavia flights were suspended. Passengers were confused, the media stunned. The entire aviation industry watched this move as though witnessing major surgery on the body of a dying giant. But inside the temporary training centers set up across the United States, over 12,000 Altavia employees were going through what Elijah Morgan called the bias decoding phase. Gone were dry lectures or generic animated training videos. The program, designed by Aegis Tech, forced each participant to confront simulated choices. What would you do if you saw a passenger being denied service because they looked different? Would you intervene or stay silent? Do you know that silence can be complicity? Elijah didn't just design the program and observe from afar. He actively participated in discussion sessions, sat with technicians, listened to ground crew share what it felt like to be looked down on just because their uniforms were dusty, and heard flight attendants cry for the first time as they admitted they once looked the other way in the face of injustice out of fear of losing their jobs. During one session in Chicago, Trevor Dane, the same man who ordered Elijah off his seat, stood up, no longer wearing his cold arrogance, but carrying a kind of broken honesty. He choked on his words. "I used to think I wasn't biased. I never said anything offensive, never openly discriminated, but I let the familiar order dictate my instincts. And now, the price is my entire career." Chloe Rivers, who had since abandoned her plan to return to aviation, joined the program in silence during the first week. But on the final day, she cried. "I knew it was wrong the moment I accepted that money from Mrs. Lane. But I didn't dare stop. I chose safety over justice. And my silence is a stain I will carry for life." As for Harland Gray, the oldest captain in the group, he didn't make excuses or protest. In a post-training internal interview, he simply said one sentence that made the entire room fall silent. "I used to believe I led with experience, but that day, I led with cowardice." 3 months later, Altavia became the first airline in the industry to achieve equal customer satisfaction scores across all races, genders, and financial backgrounds. The recovery wasn't just about image. Revenue increased by 8%, investors returned, and above all, internal staff felt, for the first time, that they were working within a system with true awareness. 6 months later, Elijah Morgan stood on stage at the Global Business Equity Summit. Beside him was CEO Richard Fontaine, his face drawn, but his gaze more resolute than ever. Elijah announced an initiative called Pathlight, a second chance program for those previously terminated due to bias-related misconduct, on the condition that they complete the full rehabilitation curriculum and contribute to community work for at least 12 months. The first 3 graduates of the program were none other than Trevor, Chloe, and Harland. They did not return to their former roles, but they found new work, lower ranking, humbler, this time to serve, not to command. Chloe became a ground crew member at a small airline. Trevor moved into baggage handling. Harland no longer flew planes but became an ethics mentor for young pilot trainees. One rainy afternoon, inside Altavia's executive office, Richard handed Elijah the final report after 6 months of reform. "We're still making amends," he said quietly. "But for the first time, we know what we need to fix." Elijah closed the folder and looked him straight in the eye. "Real change doesn't start with procedures. It starts with the courage to face the truth. Altavia may have made a grave mistake, but you didn't deny it." They shook hands, not as business partners, but as 2 men who had once stood on opposite sides of a crisis. now walking together on the path of redemption. And so, Seat 2A, once the place where a man was forced to leave simply because he didn't look like someone who belonged there, became the symbol of a historic transformation. Not because someone was punished, but because someone dared to speak up. And more importantly, because an entire system chose to listen. A system is only truly strong when it learns to confront and correct its own mistakes from within. Elijah Morgan didn't need anger or revenge. He simply chose composure and let the truth speak for itself. That is not just justice. It is also the way an entire industry learns to grow. If you believe that real change begins with courage and mutual respect, then like this video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss stories like this. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words, "Justice arrives," so we can help spread this powerful message together.